417A, April 8, 2026. Houston, Texas. 14 FBI counterintelligence agents moved through the parking lot of a commercial office park on Westheimer Road, headlights off, vehicles coasting to a stop 50 meters from the building entrance. A second convoy, 6 OFAC enforcement vehicles, held position 2 blocks east on Gessner Drive. A third unit had already sealed the loading access behind a light industrial facility on Beltway 8. Confirmed sanctions violations under investigation. $4. $3 million in transfers. If the full network held, closer to $80 million. The 4 target businesses didn't look like anything. That was the point. 3 occupied ordinary suites in ordinary commercial buildings, the kind of spaces that house accountants, insurance brokers, small logistics companies. The 4th operated out of a converted warehouse near the Port of Houston, where it held active contracts to supply parts and maintenance components to 2 U.S. Navy logistics depots. All 4 held valid DoD supplier registrations. All 4 had passed background checks. All 4 were, on paper, exactly what they claimed to be. Figuring out what they were actually doing had taken 4 months of surveillance, 2 grand jury subpoenas, and 1 piece of financial timing that nobody was supposed to notice. The first agents reached the entrance of Suite 340 at Westheimer Park. One pressed a laminated document to the glass door. Another positioned a handheld RAM. At the OFAC-led site on Beltway 8, a supervisor keyed a radio. Standby. A supervisor at the third site, a private residence in Katy, Texas, confirmed position. The 4th address, a house in Sugar Land, went simultaneously at 4:22 a.m. All 4 operations executed within 90 seconds of each other. The case didn't start with a tip. It didn't start with an informant. It started with a spreadsheet. Specifically, it started with an analyst at the Office of Foreign Assets Control noticing that a wire originating from a Latvian financial institution called Baltijas Kapitāls Service, an entity with no prior U.S. business history and no registered client relationships in North America, had cleared through a correspondent bank account in New York on February 3, 2026. The transfer amount was $218,000, routed to a company called Meridian Gulf Solutions, LLC, registered in Texas, active DoD supplier, holding contract for parts supply to Naval Station Ingleside logistics support. It wasn't the amount. OFAC analysts see wire transfers of that size dozens of times a day. It was the timing. February 3, 2026 was 11 days after the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian export terminals in the Persian Gulf had been formally announced. That same day, satellite tracking data showed 3 Iranian crude carriers had been forced to reverse course in the Strait of Hormuz. That same day, futures markets for Brent crude spiked 1%. That same day, the Iranian Ministry of Petroleum issued an internal directive, later obtained through Allied intelligence, ordering its procurement intermediaries to accelerate alternative payment routing for contracted energy deliveries. Meridian Gulf Solutions had received $218,000 from a Latvian shell entity within hours of the Iranian blockade going into full operational effect. The analyst flagged it. A second analyst reviewed it and agreed it needed a closer look. A supervisor forwarded it to the FBI field office in Houston. That was February 9th. The joint FBI-OFAC task force was formally constituted within 72 hours. The lead FBI agent assigned to the case was a counterintelligence specialist who had spent the previous 4 years tracking sanctions evasion networks in Eastern Europe. Her team pulled everything available on Baltijas Kapitāls Service in the first week. What they found was a company with no employees, no physical office in Latvia, and no transaction history prior to November 2025. It had been incorporated in Riga in October 2025, 8 weeks before the blockade was formally announced, but during the period when the diplomatic framework leading to the blockade had already been reported in international financial press. Someone had set it up in anticipation. The Latvian entity had a registered correspondent relationship with a UAE-based trading company, Falcon Horizon International, headquartered nominally in the Dubai International Financial Center. Falcon Horizon had 3 subsidiary accounts spread across banks in Bahrain, Georgia, and Cyprus. Tracing back through those accounts using mutual legal assistance treaty requests, a process that took 11 days and required coordination with 3 foreign financial intelligence units. The task force identified the original source layer, funds originating from a crude oil brokerage account tied to a state-affiliated Iranian energy procurement entity. Iranian oil revenue, rerouted through 4 jurisdictional layers, landing in the accounts of American defense subcontractors. At this point, the task force had a financial chain. What they didn't have was evidence that the contractors knew what they were receiving. That distinction mattered enormously. The difference between sanctions violations rooted in criminal intent versus unwitting receipt of tainted funds. Federal prosecutors needed to know which of the 4 companies had understood what they were part of. The answer came from a detail buried in travel records. 2 of the 4 contractors, Meridian Gulf Solutions and a second company called Pinnacle Logistics Partners, had principals who had traveled to Dubai in late 2025. Meridian's owner, a 44-year-old logistics manager named Derek Hartwell, had flown into Dubai International on November 14, 2025. His travel records showed a 3-day stay at a hotel in the Jumeirah district. He had listed the purpose of trip as regional business development. Pinnacle's managing partner, a 51-year-old named Sandra Voss, had traveled separately. Dubai, November 19, 21st, 2025. Their visits were 2 weeks apart. Their hotels were different. But both had charged meals to their company cards at the same restaurant in the Dubai Marina district on separate evenings during their trips. A restaurant that, per UAE corporate records obtained through a financial intelligence request, was partially owned by a holding company registered to a man named Reza Golistan. Reza Golistan was the brother-in-law of Hartwell's wife. He also appeared in the files of a European intelligence service as a known facilitator for Iranian state energy procurement, an intermediary who specialized in connecting Iranian crude export revenue to Western commercial entities through layered financial structures. The task force spent 3 weeks confirming the connection. When they had it confirmed, the case shifted categories. This was no longer a sanctions evasion case that might involve unwitting American businesses. At least 2 of the 4 contractors had met, directly or indirectly, with a known Iranian state procurement intermediary. They had then received money from a chain that led directly back to Iranian oil export revenue. I went through the travel documentation that came out in the subsequent court filings, and one detail kept coming back. Hartwell had been to Dubai twice before, 2021 and 2023, with no documented business outcome from either trip. The Dubai visits weren't an anomaly. They were a pattern. The other 2 contractors, a parts supply firm called Coastal Defense Components and a small logistics company called Southwestern Freight Clearance, appeared, based on initial analysis, not to have made the Dubai trips. Their principals had no documented contact with Golistan or Falcon Horizon. Their transfers from the Latvian entity were smaller, $183,000 and $197,000 respectively. The task force assessed them as probable unwitting recipients, businesses that had been incorporated into the payment routing without awareness of the source. But the task force needed to be certain, and being certain required something they didn't yet have: direct evidence of what Hartwell and Voss had discussed with their Dubai contacts. The surveillance phase of the operation ran from mid-February through late March 2026. During that period, the task force maintained physical surveillance on Hartwell and Voss, monitored financial flows through their business accounts under court-authorized tracking orders, and, after obtaining a FISA-adjacent warrant through a process that took 9 days and required approval from the FBI's National Security Law Branch, deployed technical collection on communication channels associated with Hartwell's business network. What they collected over the following 6 weeks was methodical and damning. Hartwell communicated with a contact he identified in his phone only as RGE, consistent with Reza Golistan's initials, through an encrypted messaging application approximately once every 10 to 14 days. The content of those messages, once partially recovered through technical means after Hartwell's phone was seized, showed discussions of retainer timing and routing confirmation in language that investigators assessed as deliberately oblique. In one message from March 3, 2026, Hartwell wrote, "Second installment needs different entry point. Previous channel flagged by client's compliance. The response, new corridor active. Same final amount. Timing window, end of month." On March 29, 2026, Meridian Gulf Solutions received a second wire transfer. This one originated from a different entity, a Cyprus-registered trading company with no prior transaction history. The amount, $311,000. Same ultimate source layer, per OFAC's analysis. Different routing corridor, exactly as the message had described. Hartwell had been told the previous channel had been flagged. That meant someone, somewhere in the pipeline, had become aware that the Latvian entity was attracting attention. Whether that awareness extended to knowledge of the FBI investigation specifically, or was merely general compliance caution, the task force could not determine. What's most surprising about this case isn't that Iranian sanctions money found its way into American defense contractor accounts. It's that it did so through a network that updated and adapted its routing in near real time, treating the financial sanctions framework as an engineering problem rather than a hard wall. The task force surfaced this to FBI headquarters in late March. The decision was made to move before the network could make further structural changes. Here's one piece that didn't make the public filing. The task force had identified a fifth potential contact, a third company that may have received a preliminary approach from the Falcon Horizon network and declined. That company had not been approached by investigators at the time the raid executed. Whether they came forward and what they knew remains outside the public record. The operational planning for the simultaneous warrant execution took 11 days. The challenge was coordination. 4 business addresses, 3 private residences, and 1 storage facility registered to Hartwell's wife. All in different parts of the Houston metro, all requiring simultaneous execution to prevent any single target from alerting the others. 3 days before the planned operation date, a complication emerged. Surveillance on Voss's residence picked up an unusual pattern. Her car had left the property at 11:40 p.m. on April 5th and had not returned by 2 a.m. Physical surveillance located the vehicle at a commercial storage facility in Stafford, Texas, a facility not previously associated with the investigation. Agents held observation on the facility until Voss returned to her vehicle at approximately 1:15 a.m. and drove home. The task force supervisor had 40 minutes to decide whether to advance the operation date or proceed as planned. Advancing would compress the coordination window and risk gaps in the simultaneous execution. Waiting risked Voss moving or destroying whatever she had accessed at the storage facility. They waited, and they added the storage facility to the warrant package. A sealed addendum to the original warrant application was filed with a federal magistrate at 6:30 a.m. on April 6th and approved within 4 hours. Put yourself in the task force supervisor's position for a moment. 4 months of investigative work, a meticulously coordinated multi-site operation, and at 11:40 at night, 2 days before the raid, one of your primary targets makes an unscheduled after-dark trip to a location you've never seen before. The call to wait rather than move early, with no certainty about what she'd put in that storage unit, was not an easy one. Unpopular opinion, the legal framework for tracking the financial movement in this case was sound, but the 9-day window required to obtain technical collection authority was too slow. The network had already adjusted its routing corridor once during that window. A faster authorization process for domestic sanctions enforcement, not expanded surveillance powers, but faster institutional processing, would have closed that gap. That's a structural problem, and it doesn't get fixed by arresting Hartwell and Voss. At 4:22 a.m. on April 8, 2026, all 7 locations executed simultaneously. At the Westheimer Park office of Meridian Gulf Solutions, agents secured the premises in under 4 minutes. They found Hartwell's personal laptop, powered on, screen locked, on the desk in his private office. A fireproof safe behind a framed photograph contained approximately $47,000 in cash, 2 prepaid debit cards, and a folded paper with handwritten account routing numbers that did not match any previously identified financial entity in the investigation. Forensic accountants on site photographed and inventoried every document in the office before a single item was removed. At Pinnacle Logistics Partners on Beltway 8, Voss was not present when agents entered. She was located at her Sugarland residence, where a second team had executed simultaneously. She was taken into custody without incident. Agents at her office found encrypted external drives that would take forensic specialists 11 days to partially image. At the Stafford storage facility, agents used the warrant addendum to access Unit 114, registered to a Shell LLC with no prior investigative association. Inside, 2 filing boxes containing financial records, a second laptop in a padded case, and a sealed envelope containing $23,000 in cash. The laptop, once forensically accessed, contained records suggesting Voss had been maintaining a parallel set of financial documents, records that did not appear in any of the company's official account filings. Hartwell was arrested at his Katy residence. He answered the door in a bathrobe, looked at the agents, and said nothing beyond asking for his attorney. He was transported to the FBI Houston field office. The 2 principals of the smaller companies, Coastal Defense Components and Southwestern Freight Clearance, were served with search warrants at their business addresses. Neither was arrested on April 8th. Investigators served them with grand jury subpoenas instead, consistent with the task force's assessment that they were probable unwitting recipients. Whether that assessment held after reviewing seized materials would be a question for prosecutors in the weeks that followed. Here's what this case tells us about where sanctions enforcement is now. The Iran blockade was announced with significant public lead time, long enough for financial intermediaries to begin constructing alternative routing corridors before the first vessel was turned back. The Latvian entity that initiated the Houston transfers had been incorporated 2 months before the blockade formally began. The network anticipated the enforcement environment and pre-engineered around it. That's not improvisation. That's institutional preparation. The sanctions worked as a pressure mechanism in the energy markets. As a tool for preventing revenue rerouting, they required something the law hadn't fully built yet, the speed to match the financial engineering on the other side. Hartwell was charged on April 9th with violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, wire fraud, and conspiracy to evade sanctions. Voss faced the same charges, with an additional count related to financial record falsification connected to the Stafford storage discovery. Both were denied bail at their initial hearing. Federal prosecutors argued that the communications with Reza Golistan, the documented awareness that the previous routing corridor had been flagged, and the late-night storage facility visit 2 days before the raid demonstrated a pattern of active concealment that made flight risk credible. The magistrate agreed. Golistan himself remained outside U.S. jurisdiction. An Interpol red notice was filed. As of the time the court documents became public, he had not been located. The Falcon Horizon network, the UAE-based structure that had served as the primary routing intermediary, had its assets flagged under OFAC's blocking designation authority within 48 hours of the arrests. But financial investigators noted that the network's primary accounts had already shown reduced activity in the 2 weeks preceding the raid. The routing update Hartwell and his contact had discussed in the March 3rd message had not been the only adjustment. The network had been moving. How much of the broader network's financial activity had cleared before the investigation moved to enforcement, and how much remains unaccounted for, is a question the court filings do not answer. The confirmed transfer total for the 4 Houston entities was $3 million. The projected exposure if the full Falcon Horizon routing structure had operated without disruption through the duration of the blockade, that figure, per federal prosecutor's sealed sentencing memorandum, was closer to $80 million. The $75 million gap between what was intercepted and what might have moved is, for federal investigators, an open line. Did the system fail here by moving too slowly, or was the eventual disruption of this network evidence that the enforcement framework, imperfect as it is, worked? Drop that in the comments. We read every one. One detail that stuck: the handwritten routing numbers found in the safe at Hartwell's office. Forensic accountants cross-referenced them against every financial entity identified in the investigation. None of them matched. Investigators assessed them as belonging to a third routing layer the investigation had not yet mapped, a layer that may connect to other domestic entities beyond the 4 Houston companies. Those account numbers are still being traced. The 4 companies have had their DoD supplier registrations suspended pending resolution of the criminal proceedings. The Navy logistics contracts they held, 3 active supply agreements covering parts and maintenance components for 2 Gulf Coast naval facilities, were transferred to alternate suppliers within 10 days of the arrests. Reza Golistan's location remains unknown. The Falcon Horizon International entity has been formally designated under OFAC's blocking framework, but designation does not require or guarantee asset seizure when those assets are held in non-cooperative jurisdictions. The Bahrain and Georgia subsidiary accounts have been the subject of mutual legal assistance requests. Responses, as of the last public court filing, were pending. Voss's forensic drives, partially imaged after 11 days of specialist work, suggested financial record-keeping that extended back to at least mid-2025. Months before the Dubai trip, months before the blockade, months before the Latvian entity made its first transfer. Whether that timeline alters the prosecution's theory of the case, or expands it, is not yet in the public record. The 2 principals of Coastal Defense Components and Southwestern Freight Clearance cooperated with the grand jury. Their names have not appeared in any public charging document. Whether that cooperation produced new investigative leads or confirmed what the task force already assessed, that they had been incorporated into the network without knowing it, has not been publicly disclosed. The network is disrupted. The routing infrastructure that built it still exists. The handwritten account numbers in Hartwell's safe point somewhere. Where that is, no one has said publicly. If you've heard anything about where Falcon Horizon's remaining network corridors ran, drop it in the comments. We read every one. If you want to follow where this investigation goes next, the Golistan Red Notice, the unsealed routing records, the third layer those account numbers point to, subscribe. This story isn't finished.